The first white settlement of Lake Mills occurred in 1837 and 1836. Joseph Keyes, George Farmer, and Elihu Atwood were among the first settlers. After a saw and grist mill had been built, the community grew. Joseph Keyes then sold part of his land to Jonathan Phillips and his 3 sons in 1849. Jonathan Phillips and his family came to Jefferson County from Massachusetts by way of New York State. He and his 3 sons, Frank or Franklin, Charles, and William, purchased the farm owned by Joseph Keyes. They were considered to have the first dairy farm in the county. Charles and William continued to operate the farm after the death of Frank. They imported cows from the Isle of Jersey. They were progressive and built a creamery and had installed a mechanical butter churn in 1871. They sold butter to the Chicago market. This is a picture of the old grist mill built by Joseph Keyes along the Rock River. A portrait of John Franklin Phillips. An interview with Anne Ferry Hansen, great-granddaughter of Frank, and conducted in the library of the old house. This is a part of the 1843 Keyes residence.
We'll look at some of this. I don't know who Shrek is. I can't figure
now,
this out.
As I understand it, the Phillips came to Lake Mills in 1849, is that right?
That's right.
And they bought land from the Keyes family.
Keyes, and your book that you republished. See, Dad had one copy of it. There is a copy of it in the library, and then Dad had a copy, which, under penalty of anything were we allowed to touch it, you know. And so this is the first edition, of course, which you saw.
Mm-hmm. Now, when they bought the land, were there buildings on it?
Sure, the Keyes had farmed it for 6 years. They started here in 1843.
Yes. Are any of these buildings those buildings, or were they?
Yeah, this house, the first rooms and the dining room was the kitchen.
So this building, or part of this building, was built by the Keyes family then?
Oh, yes.
All right, and we will look at that part of it a little later. But the Phillips added onto it then, is that right?
My father told me in the 1880s.
I see.
They added onto it. They raised the roof and raised the ceilings of the upstairs bedrooms, which apparently before that had been dormer windows. Is that what I mean, dormers?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And probably put in the heating plant and, you know, the furnace and the hot water radiators.
And these are essentially the same radiators and plumbing, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
So that would go back to the 1880s then.
And a coal furnace. I remember when we used to have coal delivered at the side of the house and shoveled in the window in the basement.
All right. Now, the part of the house which was built by the Keyes was still a frame building. It was not a log cabin or anything like that.
It was a frame building.
I found it sort of interesting in reading on a variety of things that even though the pioneers, when they came, built quick structures, particularly log cabins, because they could put those up in a few days and so forth, as soon as there was a sawmill, they started building frame buildings.
Well, if you read New England history, the first person to settle in an area settled on the river, on the stream, and was the one to put in the sawmill. If he chose not to put in a mill, then the next person who came could sort of move him out so that he could have the location on the water, or maybe he'd build across from him, and put in the mill, because that was important for the community.
Sure.
Sawmill and grist mill, both.
Say that again.
The Phillips family lived in Sturbridge for 100 years before they came to Wisconsin.
In the Sturbridge, Massachusetts.
Yes.
But then they, as I understand, they had moved to New York State for a period before they actually made the move out here.
Yes, Jonathan Perry Phillips is really interesting fellow. He was born in 1792, and he learned a blacksmith trade.
I see.
And he left home when he was 21. He went for Oneida, New York on horseback, and he had $25 in his pocket, and that was his start in life. He went to Whitestown, New York, which was up on the river across from Canada. It's a very northern part of New York State, and has since disappeared, a small village. And there he met Sophronia Jocelyn from Turingham, Massachusetts, and they were married in 1817. And after a while they moved to Canastota, where he carried on a business in blacksmithing and wagon making. And I think perhaps that was the covered wagons.
Yes, yes, that's where the name for the covered wagons came from.
So I think he worked on covered wagons.
But when they came out here, did they come with a covered wagon? They
That's
must have
what
come.
I don't know.
Well,
But
most of the early ones seem to have come by ship through the Great Lakes and then Milwaukee or something of that sort.
There was a large green chest that we had in one of the buildings in back that, according to family's tradition, had come by way of the Erie Canal. So I think they came on the Erie Canal to Chicago.
No, the Erie Canal stops
Before that.
before, and then they have to get onto the lakes, and then
Yes.
I don't know if they would go all the way up around. They might go to Detroit and then across, and but it seemed to me that most of them would end up getting to Wisconsin by boat to Milwaukee or Chicago.
Well, there is, oh dear. Turn it off a minute, if I got it straight.
Now, your grandmother was Cora Phillips Ferry.
Yes, and she was born here.
And she was born in about 1856, is that correct?
Yes.
In fact, just about this day, I think it was
That's
in
right,
September.
September 20th.
And she was the daughter of J. Franklin Phillips, also called Frank.
Yes, he dropped the G, the John.
Although he didn't live too long, I understand that he died about 1862.
Well, let me see. Cora was about, 4 or 5 years old, I think.
And then, which
He
would
died
be
in 1855, yeah.
and his wife, Elma, or Emmeline, or
No, wait.
Elmira, I guess,
Whose wife?
Frank's.
Frank's wife was Minerva
Minerva, all right.
Butterfield, and she was called Mina.
Mina, I see, all right.
That's to distinguish Mina, and then Aunt Mai was Elmira.
I see.
And she lived here too. And they built the house just north of the apartments for her. The Phillips built that house for
Where?
Elmira.
Where Mary Ferry lived?
No.
No.
Where Paul Helms lived.
Oh, all
That
right.
house.
Those apartments, all right.
No, it's the house. It's not.
Well, I know,
apartments.
but I was,
that apartment.
I categorized myself
I
because
know.
when we used to talk about the apartment house, it was actually the old Rock Lake
Yes,
Hotel,
way down there. Yeah,
which I
yeah.
understand that some of your relatives were involved with.
Were they?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
They were on the board of directors of that
Oh.
when it was built in the early 1900s, I believe it was. And they were active in many things, you know.
I suppose.
I believe Charlie was a legislator
Yes, he
at
was.
one time for
He
about
was.
7 years or
And
so.
there's a whole volume up there of memorial addresses when he died.
I also found out that the Phillips were very instrumental in getting the railroad to be closer
Probably.
to Lake Mills.
Probably.
Originally it was planned to run about 2 miles further south, I suppose to avoid all the lake, you know.
That might be.
And they convinced him that it could be built a lot closer, and therefore only just down the road. And they actually helped the railroad to procure the right-of-ways through Jefferson County, so obviously they had a little clout then, too.
Yes, they probably did. Well, I know that he used to go to Madison to the legislature, and he had a little desk, a lap desk, that he used on the train to do his work on. And my brother has that in Milwaukee. I don't know if he still has now that they've moved away.
I also understood reading that as farmers they were very progressive and had some of the very first purebred cattle brought from Europe here.
They sent for cattle from Scotland. They were Ayrshires. And I have a book upstairs on them. And you know, there is a little notebook with the names of the cattle and how much they paid at that time.
Now the Phillips were certainly farmers, and they were very progressive, as we said, and I'm not sure which of your ancestors it was, but one of those, and I think it's maybe the Butterfield wife, saw a report of a mechanical churn way back in 1871.
Yes.
And she made sure that they got one of those, and they really started the first dairy in Wisconsin based on that, about somewheres in the early 1870s.
We have a diary that Aunt Mate wrote. Aunt Mate being Eliza Butterfield, Mary Eliza.
Mary Eliza.
And she churned almost every day. And I suppose it was after they got the mechanical butter churn that they churned so much. They used to send butter to Chicago. And one time she spilled the yellow butter color, and it got too yellow, so they sent it down to St. Louis. And oh, the St. Louis people said, oh, send some more of that wonderful Wisconsin yellow butter. That was always a family joke.
I think that was probably one reason why they were so interested in having the railroad come close, because they sent their butter to Chicago by rail, as I understand.
I imagine. And I think they bought the butter color from the Fargo.
Oh, that
people.
Could be.
They had a store downtown that sold yellow butter color.
And the large barn that used to be out and back, I understand that was built about 1877.
I don't even know. I don't know where you found in the paper. Did you?
Yes.
The stone house behind here is called the milk house because in the lower floor of that house is where they made the butter and bottled the milk for the dairy for the town. And Mr. and Mrs. Jenks that lived just down the street were the dairy people for a long time, and they got so arthritic working in that damp stone building, they finally persuaded my dad to build a different building for them. And I think they bought a building from the people that had the farm up at the golf course.
I see, yes.
And that was about the time, well, no, it must have been before that. But they bought that building, my brother says, and moved it down here. And that's where the dairy was for a long time.
Now, you and your family, the Ferries, moved out here when?
About 1920.
About 1920. Before that, you had lived in Milwaukee. Although you would come out to visit and for vacations and things of that sort.
Yes, there used to be a cottage across the street where those apartments are. And that my father's father was an architect, and he had built it for some friends from Indiana, that they were very good friends, and they came up in the summer. And the cottage had a central living room and then bedrooms on either side, one side for each family. And they came out here and spent the summers. And even when my father was a little boy, they used to come out there. And it was because his mother, Cora, had such fondness for this house, and her aunt and uncle were so close to her and had still lived here and wanted her to come back to live.
I see. Mm-hmm. This is the original house built, as far as you know, about 1843 then.
I'm sure my father rebuilt the fireplaces because
They still are the original floors as far as you know?
Yes, a single layer. Now your plug is...
This heating system, the hot water system, still goes back to...
Well, I think the 1880. No, that's such a general date now that I think that's 100 years ago.
Tell me about this particular bit of
No,
furniture.
Not a thing. I don't
But
know
it's
where
been
it
in the
came from.
family for a long while, is that right?
Yes, it is. One of the Phillips girls, there was a large family here, too, and my father said she took all the old antiques with her. But I don't know that that's true. When my father and mother moved out here in 1920, they went to Columbus and bought a whole house full of furniture from somebody who had died over there. And some of this furniture is from there.
About what date was this picture taken of the old house?
I wouldn't have any idea.
And the stone house was the old original milk house.
Yeah. Well, that was the library. In early electrical days when we had electric lights.
And you say the room we were in was the library and this was the living room.
Yes.
I see.
And I think this is one of the old rocking chairs from, I like to think this rocking chair came down from the early Phillips family, and I'm not sure. It's in the early pictures that Uncle Phil and my father had of the early house.
This clock then was from the Ferry side of the family. Was your mother's?
Yes.
And it was built specially for her?
Made for her by her father, who was Dr. George Ladd in Milwaukee. Feeling among my girls, who was going to get the desk, you know. I can just see that. In these windows. And the French windows wind out for air in the summertime. And then the storm windows fit on the inside. The way. Because in the original house, when my father and mother moved out here, those green tiles were out in a box in the barn. And so they had the fireplace rebuilt to use the tiles. And I think they're Flemish. Is Flemish part of Belgium? And they're very beautiful. And it's always surprised me how Japanese in style they are. But I suppose
This room was the kitchen of the original house. It now serves as a dining room. To its left, it has a small bedroom. And you feel this was probably a bedroom?
yes,
in the
because
original
there's a
house.
story about, I don't know who it was, one of the women who came here with a child to live. Now it may have been Elmira Phillips with her son. Oh, she had 3 sons. But when she came back here after Mr. Kennedy died, she wallpapered the room with a paste that turned bad after a few weeks, and she couldn't stand to live in the room because it smelled so bad, and everybody teased her about her wallpapering job. Fine tin tub. And where the tin has worn off, the copper shows through more. But the hard water makes awful spots on it.
And when was this put in?
I suppose in the 80s. I don't know. I had to take the faucets to Milwaukee to get them plated. This is the old dinner horn that was used on the farm to call the men in from the fields for breakfast and for dinner. The grandchildren loved to blow on this. Those things up at
Now this is the old 1877 barn, is that right?
Yes, uh-huh.
Yeah, a
And
drawing
then
of
the
it.
little one down at this end that you see the roof of was the dairy that had to be built closer to the barn because the man who was running the dairy in those years sold it to the Chicago milk business, and they require that you have a, what do I say, milk cooling business closer to the source of the
You say this is the horse barn, or a drawing
This
of
is
it?
a horse barn, and the basement of it, built into the hill with stones, is still out there. And that was where the horses were. This upper part was for storage of wagons, and then the third upper part of this was where they stored the hay. Then we redid the floors.
When was this kitchen built then? Was this was a later
This was part
addition?
of the addition in the 1880s.
And did they have running water, or was this, they brought the water
Well,
in?
there's a cistern downstairs. They had running water.
This is one of the original stoves?
I think it was in the basement. Didn't people use stoves like that for canning?
They could well have, yes. In a lot of places, they seem to do the cooking away from the
From the kitchen?
rest of the house.
So it was on the back porch. Imagine having a key for that.
A key for the outhouse, that's
Yeah.
sort of interesting. What about that one larger key that seems corroded?
I don't know. Isn't that neat?
Yeah, that looks quite old.
It does. But shapes of the little keys. This one on its old string. This one has the heart shape. Get this out of the way for you.
And this was the dish pantry,
Yes.
which was sort of between the kitchen and the dining room.
And in the original part of this, there was a cupboard built right across here with a little pass-through hole for passing the dishes through. And when we children were little, of course, we used to crawl through it. And my mother eventually took it out, and she left part of it in here for the drawers on this side and for the cupboards to be built on that side. So that must have been done in the 20s.
So light has been here just about as long as the house, is that right?
Yes,
Or as
that's
long as
right.
there's electricity anyway.
Yeah, child and made cookies. We had to go into the pantry and get the flour and the sugar and the shortening.
They would have had sugar and flour and other things like that in these bins.
I guess so.
The old wooden stairway leading down from the hallway of the kitchen to the basement, with the old cistern to its left as you come down the stairs.
I haven't any idea.
It was your grandmother's?
Great.
Great-great-grandmother's. And it was for spinning wool.
Let me see. Patented March 1856. Manufactured by J.B. Waite Company, Waitsville, Jefferson County, Wisconsin.
It's an old apple cider press, is that it?
That's right.
And whose was this?
This was here. Probably the Phillips's.
These are still the old original timbers when the house was built.
Yes, and when we go down this other way, there's some.
These are original supporting things, and they just slabbed it off and left the bark right on.
Apparently so. It's over there, and it's set to go on 12 hours a day, but it looks like it isn't going very well.
But the original foundation, which the Kais put in, was brick then.
Yes. Yes, and this little round brick door, isn't that darling?
Yeah.
Something on the floor in here because it stays nice and cold. And we could close that off.
Does anyone know where this brick was made?
No. I just assumed, you know, it's probably trying to keep it drier.
Part of the old stone foundation right here then.
I can't figure out is why would they put ceilings in them? Something I've never been able to figure out.
You don't often see plastered ceilings in basements. But this was a part of the old fruit storage or cold storage part of the house then.
Perhaps.
This right side of the basement seems to be a bricked over room that no longer exists, and it has a old brick floor.
You never got put out in the old tool collection.
Yeah. And that looks like an old butter paddle or some sort of milk paddle. And it says there's an old grain flail.
And it weighs a ton. It's heavy. It's just plain old, grubby, hard work. And heavy. Is it iron? Corn planter.
Potato planter. Going outside to the ice house.
And the ice was packed in sawdust. And many years ago they closed out the front entrance, took down the partition and made the whole thing into a... When we moved out here, Lieb, up on that shelf was where the spinning wheels were. The corn things, you want to walk back that way? The corn samples from the different rows up there. In fact, Connor had some corn on some of those corn hangers. In here, see the chimney?
An old dinner bell, also used for calling farmers from the fields. And an old milk weighing scale of an early era. The current house has mortared limestone foundations. This then is perhaps one of the earliest homes in Lake Mills still remaining.